Hey folks, Zach Osterman here, Insider Indianapolis Star with your Friday rundown for September 19th, 2025. Obviously, one topic that's going to be on everyone's minds above everything else, but we'll cover some other ground quickly today. Just to kind of give you a sense for running around IU sports. Volleyball still undefeated at Western Kentucky tonight, Friday night. Western Kentucky is receiving votes in the latest top 25, so that's at least kind of an intriguing, I think right now the Miami win, the reverse sweep against Miami is probably Indiana's best win, but Western Kentucky at Western Kentucky when the Hilltoppers are receiving votes is certainly the kind of result that would turn some heads further. That game actually is going to be on ESPN Plus. That match, if you want to watch it, is tonight against Western Kentucky. A couple of big conference games for IU soccer coming up. I got my notes down here. Penn State at Penn State Friday night, hosting Michigan State on Tuesday night. Indiana, we talk so much about the impressive non-conference, and Indiana winds up kind of getting off to a rocky start instead in conference play, loses 3-2 Saturday night at home against Michigan. Todd Yeagley's team will want to get kind of back up in the saddle quickly. With a pair of Big Ten games this week, you get a little bit, you get those slightly tighter turns at times, obviously, once you get to Big Ten play. On the basketball front, schedules are out for men and women. Go to indystar.com/sports and Herald Times Online. The schedules are there. There's analysis of the schedules, some breakdowns, certainly some thoughts on the men's side. What looks right now like a pretty old school non-conference coupled with a very difficult, I think, January. That is kind of going to be proving ground, for better or worse, for Darren DeVries in his first season in Bloomington. And we also got the announcement this week of both a scrimmage on October 3rd and also Haunted Hall of Hoops on October 30th. It's not clear what basketball-specific activity, if any, Haunted Hall of Hoops will kind of include. In the past, that has been a scrimmage, and I wouldn't be surprised if there's an element to that again. Obviously, the big appeal of it, if you will, is the chance to interact with fans, particularly the chance to interact with young fans. And if you look at it in totality, Indiana's going to have Hoosier Hoops. Again, got the schedule right here. Hoosier Hoops on Kirkwood on the 2nd. That open scrimmage at Assembly Hall on the 3rd. They host Marion on the 17th. This is all in October. They play Baylor and Indy on the 26th. And then they have Haunted Hall of Hoops on the 30th, which is a little less than a week before their opener. That schedule, that's a busy October, frankly. Not terribly busy, but it's a little bit more than the average. And if you look at it closely, in the way that Indiana has sort of broken up Hoosier Hysteria into two events, one of them in a more public square on Kirkwood, and the other one maybe a little bit more familiar, the open scrimmage the next day. The idea that maybe you can get the scrimmage, which is much more sort of for the basketball purists, kind of unto itself, if that's what you're looking for. If you were looking for sort of more the pep rally and the festive atmosphere of a Midnight Madness type event, you've got the Hoosier Hoops on Kirkwood event on the night of the 2nd. And then Haunted Hall of Hoops on the 30th. Listen, I think this is all really meant to sort of try and bring the program back to a fan base that undeniably, I think, and not just for results-based reasons, but also because of sort of the way the program has been walled off in recent years. I think this is an attempt to sort of bring the fan base back to the program a little bit, or maybe vice versa, bring the program back to the fan base and really try to maybe rebuild, some of that mutual relationship. I think that's particularly important for the athletics department with students. Quite frankly, the student section has struggled to fill up the last couple of years. You understand why. I think it was only full for 1 or 2 games last season. One of those was Purdue, which is, of course, a game Indiana wound up winning comfortably. The athletics department is pretty committed to the idea of a large student section. It's always been right around 7,800, pretty much as long as I've been on the beat. And seeing that section empty, I think is going to cause some consternation for Scott Dolson and his team. And I think a lot of this is about trying to kind of reignite some of the enthusiasm within the fan base, and certainly within the student fan base here in the build-up to Darren DeVries' first season in Bloomington. I'll probably write more on that closer to some of those events, because I do think it's an important recognition of maybe some of the things that need to be addressed with this program off the court, as much as things that are obviously getting addressed on the court when we talk about what we saw in Puerto Rico or what we'll see in these scrimmages and things like that. That's all kind of the housekeeping. The big story this week, undeniably, Illinois, 7:30 p.m. Saturday night, Memorial Stadium. Game is set for NBC, and I believe you can also watch on Peacock if you're not going to make it. It is sold out. Indiana issued more than 450 credentials. If you include, sort of print press, TV press, TV crew, photographers. It is going to be a full house. There's a long, long list of recruiting visitors expected to be there. Wouldn't be stunned if you see some dignitaries from the conference there. This is undeniably kind of the marquee game of the week in the Big Ten. And, I think this is, it's not just in Bloomington. I think a lot of people have had this game circled for a while, because these two teams were, if you weren't getting sort of bogged down in the political discourse around Indiana and the playoff, these were two really fascinating kind of case studies in something that I think is good for the conference, which is the idea that, the Big Ten has always been strong at the top, and it got stronger when it added Oregon to your Ohio States, your Penn States, at least in recent times, your Michigans. I know Michigan's kind of on a bit of a dip right now, but we'll see if Sharon Moore pulls them back up. What the Big Ten needs is a really solid middle class to kind of balance itself out against the SEC. And the idea that you can have a top 20 matchup on, an in-conference top 20 matchup on September 19th, and it doesn't include any of Ohio State, Michigan, Penn State, or Oregon, or even, if you want to include Southern Cal, or, maybe some sort of latter-day, robust Big Ten programs like Iowa or Wisconsin, obviously having their own issues right now, but, two programs that sort of recognized a need to be better in football, a need to be more competitive in football, a need to invest not just more, but more wisely in football. And they are achieving, that at a considerable rate. Obviously Brett Bielema has kind of gotten things going in Champaign. And of course, Kurt Cignetti here in year 2 holds very high ambitions for Indiana as well. And so I think that it's been circled on these fan bases' calendars since really the end of last season, because you did feel like this would be a chance for one of these two teams to make a playoff level statement pretty quickly. But it's all, I think it's relevant that this has also been one of the games that kind of got a pin pushed into it during the, sort of the Big Ten offseason and, around the conference. I think people were looking at this game and saying that's going to be really interesting. Looking forward to that, hoping both teams can start 3-0 to really make that game what we think it's going to be. It is, and you've probably heard some of these numbers, but it's the first all top 20 matchup inside Memorial Stadium since 1987. Indiana beat Michigan. Indiana was actually ranked ahead of Michigan that day. I think it was maybe 15th and 19th or 15th and 20th. That's the last time Indiana played a game at home where both teams were ranked in the top 20. It's the first time since Nebraska last year where both teams were ranked at all in either poll. And if Indiana wins, and I've repeated this statistic or this fact ad nauseum, if Indiana wins, it will be the Hoosiers' first win against a top 10 team in front of fans at home in 58 years. The last time Indiana achieved that was that famous win over, I think it was number 3 Purdue, in 1967 to give Indiana the right to the Big Ten's Rose Bowl berth. So in terms of the build-up, if you go to indystar.com/sports, you'll find a whole bunch of stuff. Mike Neislick and I, Aaron Ferguson, we did a really fun exercise where Aaron, sort of marshaled a bit of a debate back and forth between us that sprang out of our post-game podcast last week, where, we were just kind of debating, like, this is the biggest Indiana home game since when? And Mike contended it was since Michigan last year. I contend that it's got more historical significance than that. But we had a really fun conversation about that on the podcast last Saturday, and then Tuesday as well. And then we also did this for kind of if you prefer the written word, if you prefer kind of the print version, so to speak. We did a debate on kind of the stakes of this. I had a piece for Indy Star Sports and USA Today Sports, kind of looking at Curt Cignetti's background and asking more the question of, less about sort of his success in his last 4 or 5 years and more about examining when Cignetti really felt like he'd kind of found a process that worked, because obviously we have heard so much from him about the success that he's had, the success that process yields. You can see it in 14 winning seasons in 14 years, in the success he had at JMU, of course, what he's done so far at Indiana. But it's going further back to his time at Elon, to his time as a first-time head coach at IUP in Pennsylvania. Even looking at some of his background, not even just with Nick Saban, but also coaches like Johnny Majors and Walt Harris and Chuck Amato, and of course his dad, Frank Cignetti Sr. And so that was a really interesting story to kind of put together, to just maybe examine Cignetti's journey, so to speak, from a slightly different angle. And then, Mike's got all his primer content, looking at keys to this game and different things like that. And we'll get into our 3 keys here in a minute. But indystar.com/sports, heraldtimesonline.com, as ever, that's where you can find all of our build-up for this game. And there's been a ton. And of course, we will have a lot to bring you after the game, late Saturday into Sunday. But it is going to be, a lot of eyes around college football are going to be on Bloomington, Indiana on Saturday night. And that has not been common for this program in even really the last, 5 or 6 years when Indiana's had some success. This is a different kind of stage, and it'll be fascinating to see how Indiana performs on it. On our 3 keys to this, number 1 is quarterback play. I mean, that's simplistic, but it's going to define at least a portion of this game. If you look at their numbers, Luke Altmaier and Fernando Mendoza are remarkably similar statistically. I mean, we're talking a completion or 2 in one direction or the other, a few yards. I think Altmaier has 8 touchdown passes and Mendoza has 9. Neither one of them has thrown an interception. Both of them are completing comfortably more than 70% of their passes. They have had very similar starts to the season. And the question you kind of have is, which one handles this better? Altmaier's obviously got experience in road environments. He's been at Penn State. He led Illinois to a win, I believe, at Nebraska last year. Obviously, he sort of captains them to a win in the Citrus Bowl. So you would imagine that the environment's not going to bother him as much. Whereas this is Fernando Mendoza's first Big Ten game. He does have the ACC experience. Is it any different? Does it look any different? He's going to be facing a pretty good pass rush. We'll get to that in a minute. Does Altmaier's experience tell? Does Mendoza have another level that he can go up, especially in a big game at home? And I think, part of it, and this we will segue key number 1, which is quarterback play, into key number 2, which is the line of scrimmage. I think part of it is how these 2 quarterbacks handle the pass rush and how their offensive lines keep that pass rush away from them. Because down to key number 2, these are 2 of the most disruptive defensive fronts in the conference. Indiana and Illinois consistently have been among the best teams across the last 15, 16 games, going back to the start of last season, in terms of pressures, havoc plays, disruptive plays. Indiana has been better by the numbers at times this season. Of course, Illinois has played at least one Power 4 opponent. What's the gap between Old Dominion and Duke? I don't know. But Illinois also did go to Duke for that game, so it's worth pointing out they did go on the road for that, even if Duke's not a particularly hostile environment. But you have 2 defensive fronts that can be very disruptive and can be very productive in things like pressures and sacks and tackles for loss. It's in the other direction that I think Indiana might have an advantage kind of in this conversation, which is Indiana's offensive line is probably fair to say so far put together better or more complete performances than Illinois' offensive line. Illinois has not run the ball quite as well as Indiana, although nobody has. To be fair, in the Big Ten, Indiana is currently leading the Big Ten in rushing offense at 307.7 yards per game. But Illinois has only rushed for 164.7 per game. And if you look at the game by game on that, they've only rushed for over 100 yards in one game. No, excuse me, that's rush defense. How did I wind up? I was on rush offense. I'm not sure how I wound up on rush defense. There it is. They rushed for 209 against Western Illinois. They have rushed for 123 and 162 in the two games since. They do have 3 rushing touchdowns in each game. Sometimes that's a function of explosiveness. Sometimes it's a function of, down in distance. It is worth saying their worst rushing performance was against Duke. They averaged less than 3 yards a carry in that game, only rushed 123 yards on 42 attempts. The point is, Indiana runs the ball better, and if you take that in concert with where Illinois is, they are 16th in the conference in tackles for loss allowed. They are last in the conference in sacks allowed. They're the only team in the Big Ten that's allowed 9 sacks already this season. That's in comparison to Indiana, which has only allowed 1 sack, which is the one of the best numbers, not the best number, but one of the best numbers in the conference this season. And Indiana's only allowed 9 tackles for loss, which is again one of the best numbers in the conference this season. Now, again, you can talk about who these two teams have played, but if you're Illinois, no matter who the opponent is, it's going to keep you up a little bit at night that you have some issues along your offensive line, both establishing the run and then keeping the opposing defensive front out of your backfield. It's going to keep you up at night when you're facing a team that has 30 tackles for loss in the last 2 games combined. So again, sort of key number 1, quarterback play, feeds very comfortably into key number 2, which is who can disrupt the line of scrimmage more, who can maybe keep that disruption to a minimum more. And if it's Indiana, then can Luke Altmaier compensate? Can he play through some of that? And then the last key is Xavier Scott's absence. Brett Bielema was asked earlier in the week. Xavier Scott is Illinois' number 1 corner. Would he be back this week? And Bielema was kind of evasive. He said, I don't know if it'll be this week. I don't know if it's a season thing. But he said, regarding Indiana specifically, he said, right now, no. Now that was earlier in the week. That was not a definitive. He will not play. So keep an eye on the Big Ten required availability report. But if Scott's out, then the question you ask if you're Illinois, especially because you're going to need to leverage that ability to be disruptive along the line of scrimmage defensively, is do you have a player you trust in man coverage? Do you have a corner that you trust in man-to-man, one-on-one coverage against at least one of Omar Cooper or Elijah Surratt? Because if you don't, then you are probably going to be playing more zone defense. And if you're playing more zone defense, then you're probably not going to be able to get, had advantages between the tackles against Indiana's run game. And so suddenly that makes it maybe more difficult to slow down Indiana's rushing attack, which then opens things up in the pass. That pins your pass rush back and kind of takes it out of the game. If Scott does not play and Illinois has to play a lot more zone, then I think that really benefits Indiana substantially in this game. So those are our 3 keys. I guess just for sort of a final thought, because this is running a little bit long, but there was a lot to talk about because this is a big game. This is as big of a game from the standpoint of, sort of interest and build up. And I think opportunity, frankly, as I've seen Indiana face in a while. Even last season at times just sort of felt like such a whirlwind that Indiana was just sort of swept on this wave of emotion that couldn't be slowed down. This isn't that. This is a team, really presented with a chance to make an early statement about itself against, let's be fair, some pretty widespread criticism, but it's not going to be easy. If Indiana wins this game, it will be earned because Illinois is tough, Illinois is experienced, Illinois' got some depth, and Brett Bielema's no mug as a head coach. So we'll see how it all plays out. We'll be there, Merchants Bank Field at Memorial Stadium on Saturday night, 7:30 p.m. kickoff on NBC. Until then, for the Indianapolis Star, I'm Zach Osterman. Thanks for watching. We'll talk to you soon.